They created a blueprint that could be used all across the country. It was an example of what things could be.
The idea of a nice way of getting from one town to another without the fear of getting stuck in the mud was a real novel idea.
The ideal section was the road of the future, and it is a piece of transportation history.
One wouldn't expect a mile of country roadway to have a profound effect on hundreds of thousands of miles of American transportation, but in northern Indiana, a short stretch of road would do just that, setting a standard to bring the country out of the mud and into the automobile age. A road that was so advanced, they called it ideal. Americans love their cars. They get us where we need to be, on our schedule, and in a comfortable way. But automobile travel of a century ago looked nothing like today's road system. At the beginning of the 20th century, Americans were becoming enamored with motorized transport. And with the introduction of Henry Ford's Model T, the first mass-produced automobile, more Americans than ever were able to afford individualized transportation. An ever-increasing number of cars and trucks were being purchased, but the practicality of the automobile was limited because of lack of suitable roads. Cities like New York and Chicago had developed systems of paved roads for cars, wagons, and more. But for most of the country's 2 million miles of road, automobile travel was limited to basic dirt paths, causing inconvenience and frustration.
When the conditions were dry, it was an easy trip. When it rained, then you had problems. It was very common to be axle deep in mud, to literally have to dig yourself out or knock on a local farmer's door and ask him to tow you out. It happened quite frequently.
Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa were called the mud states because it was basically the prairies and it got very, very muddy. And in the wintertime, you had snow and then there was ice, and it was not easy to move around in the country.
Even before the rise of the auto, there was a push to provide a better system of roads throughout the country. The Good Roads Movement, as it was called, was created by bicyclists in the late 1800s, but it found more advocates as auto enthusiasts experienced frustrations of the road.
As more and more people obtained automobiles, the concept of having good roads caught on.
Auto manufacturers and enthusiasts desperately wanted a better driving experience, and one Indiana entrepreneur would take the task into his own hands.
Carl Fisher is from Greensburg, Indiana, and very much of an entrepreneur. He also founded the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for the testing of cars and in a race that we're all familiar with. But at the end of the day, I think he was mostly a marketer. He wanted to sell more cars, sell more lights for all kinds of cars.
Carl Fisher's difficult country trips motivated him to improve the roads around his hometown of Indianapolis. He then envisioned a plan to facilitate auto travel with a coast-to-coast rock highway. He then pitched the idea to friends and leaders in the auto industry.
He proposed that they would build a 3,000-mile rock highway from New York City to San Francisco. He said, "Gentlemen, we have to do this before we're too old to enjoy it," because they all wanted to get out in their automobiles.
Within a month, Fisher's friends in the auto industry pledged $1 million. Newspapers and magazines across the country excitedly reported and supported the plan, which would be named the Lincoln Highway in honor of our 16th president. On July 1st, 1913, the Lincoln Highway Association was formed to establish a continuous improved highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific, open to lawful traffic of all descriptions without toll charges.
The whole concept of the Lincoln Highway was, let's get the federal government involved and encourage people to start spending some money on building roads.
In the fall of 1913, the route was finalized, and the Lincoln Highway would consist of 3,389 miles of trails that would wind through 12 states. The association partnered with local clubs and municipalities to develop, mark, and map the trails that would make up the Lincoln Highway. They also implemented a membership program and created a system of councils to represent and promote the association along the way.
Throughout the whole Lincoln Highway, there were state councilmen, county councilmen, and then town councilmen. And August Stummel was the Lake County Council. He was the go-between between the Lincoln Highway and the people. August Stummel would promote the Lincoln Highway, selling bonds and certificates, so he was very instrumental in getting this roadway through here.
Because of cost, the association improved very little of the actual highway route. Rather, funds were used for marketing, promotion, and the construction of what they called seedling miles to be constructed in each state. Their goal was to have travelers, especially in rural areas, experience the benefits of good roads firsthand in order to garner more support.
Across the country in a variety of places, they would pave a mile, and they would get local and state personnel and people to come up with the money.
They would get somebody to come out and grade it, and then they would get the donation of concrete, and they would pour this concrete slab. And the idea was to convince farmers that they should pay for this sort of thing, even if it was through your taxes. This isn't just for the Peacock Alley folks back in Chicago or Indianapolis. You know, this is something we should all have.
The Seedling Mile program sparked greater interest in the country's rural areas, and small towns like Dyer realized the potential of a national road passing through their community. The Lincoln Highway was slowly creating a fervor for better roads 1 mile at a time. But the onset of World War I diverted attention and resources away from the Better Roads movement. After the war, attention was quickly focused back on improving the country. Hundreds of thousands of men returned home with a desire to move the country forward, and the sad state of our country's road system was a cause for major concern.
These military men came back from Europe and they saw highway systems over there where they could move material and troops, and they said the United States needs that just in case.
The whole idea was, what happens if war comes to the United States? How do we get our military from one place to another place on roads that haven't been improved, that aren't wide enough for the large vehicles, bridges that cannot handle the weight? How are we going to do this?
The U.S. military set out to determine the practicality of strategic movement using automobiles, and utilized the Lincoln Highway for a cross-country convoy to assess the state of America's roads.
In 1919, the military hit the road in Washington, D.C., and they came up through Pennsylvania, picked up the Lincoln Highway, and went across country to San Francisco.
As this military convoy was traveling across the United States, they found at different places bridges that would not support the weight of the vehicles, and they immediately had to halt the convoy, reroute, and then connect up again with the Lincoln Highway.
Most of the highway was still dirt road, not capable of withstanding the loads of military trucks, let alone somebody hauling grain or oil or something like that cross country.
The federal government couldn't ignore that good roads were a key part of America's growth and future strength. By 1921, there were more than 9 million automobiles on America's roads. Even President Harding rode to his inauguration in a Packard Twin 6, the first time a president took an automobile instead of a horse-drawn carriage. Admitting that proper roads were paramount to our future, the federal government passed the Highway Act, which provided $75 million in federal funds for road construction.
The government began to start spending more money, and the Lincoln Highway had accomplished one of their main goals, and that was encourage federal government to spend the money on the roads. So what's next?
With federal funds now available, a slew of named highways sprouted up around the country, some with intermittent improvements like a layer of macadam, but most with still poor driving surfaces. The Lincoln Highway Association realized that this was the perfect time to present their vision of the ideal roadway to the country and the world.
Their goal was to show the world this is how you really should build a road. Take into account the safety, the environment, and incorporate all of this into an ideal section.
Before they could create an ideal, they had to determine what that ideal would be. so the LHA sent nearly 4,600 questionnaires to engineers across the country and compiled their replies as a basis of discussion. The association created a team of 17 of the world's most prominent roadway engineers and scholars to contribute their expertise and lay out the basic principles of design for the Lincoln Highway. Many of those notable principles of modern roadways are still used today.
It should be 10-inch thick concrete, reinforced with steel bars. It should have specially designed bridges. It should have banked elevations. It should have gutters that direct rain off of the road.
A project like this was sure to bring attention to the surrounding community, so the placement of the ideal section was highly anticipated.
There were many communities that wanted this, and they established that there were 4 locations that would meet the criteria.
They started out with Pennsylvania, Ohio, Nebraska, Indiana, and so out of 3,000 plus miles of highway that they could have built the ideal section on, they chose Indiana.
With a location set, the association prepared to implement 18 agreed-upon principles of design into a 1-mile piece of road. The work was contracted out to J.C. O'Connor & Sons of Fort Wayne, and construction began in 1922. Materials were brought to the site using a 24-inch gauge industrial rail system. Extreme care was taken to make sure the concrete was laid according to plan, and the actual paving of the road was completed in December of that year.
They did implement a lot of the latest technology in road building. It was a 4-lane highway, so you had 2 lanes going in each direction. The road was crowned and there was a drainage system.
The design, the engineering, the safety, everything that was the most technologically advanced at the time went into building the ideal section.
Additional amenities were installed between 1923 and 1924, which included electric lighting and beautification of the surrounding area.
They also brought in a landscaper named Jens Jensen to landscape the whole area.
Jensen was a national figure. He actually put in a walkway for pedestrians along the ideal section.
It was landscaped, it was drained, it was paved. You can visualize the man and the woman walking with a parasol over their head down the side of it, and it's spectacularly beautiful.
The final price tag for the ideal section? $167,000 for a 1 1/3 mile road which stretched from the Illinois-Indiana state line to Cherville, Indiana. A truly accomplished work of engineering, the ideal section garnered attention from around the world. Magazines and newspapers called the ideal section a vision of the future.
There were newspaper articles about the ideal section in Japanese newspapers. So the outreach of this was worldwide.
It became an example that many cities, towns, and states could use and move the whole paving of America to a whole different level.
The ideal section was seen as a crown jewel of the Lincoln Highway. A few years later, an addition to the section would further place it as the most important piece of roadway on the country's favorite transcontinental highway. The Osterman Memorial Seat was erected on the south side of the highway as a dedication to an integral figure of the Lincoln Highway Association.
Henry Osterman was killed on the Lincoln Highway. He was doing his job, promoting. It wasn't long after his death that the Lincoln Highway Association executives decided that this would be a good place to put a memorial to Henry.
As advanced and groundbreaking as the ideal section was, its life as a road far beyond any other was short-lived. Engineers studied the road and taught the lessons learned to the next generation of civil engineers. Soon, modern roadways were being laid all around the country, and it wouldn't take long for the ideal section to be forgotten.
The ideal section was probably a victim of its own success. It was a state-of-the-art road in 1922, and pretty soon every state had a highway department. They all had these engineers going to school to learn how to build the best road possible. So eventually the ideal section just became part of the highway.
The Lincoln Highway showed us why we needed better roads, and the ideal section taught us how to make them a reality. Now, the federal government was ready to take the lead with a plan to create 75,000 miles of numbered highways in 1925. With their goals accomplished, the Lincoln Highway Association bowed out of the highway business in 1928, but concluded with one last operation to commemorate its place in American history. Over 2,000 concrete markers were placed along the route with the help of Boy Scout troops across the country. Even with the association dissolved, the Lincoln Highway would live on in the hearts and minds of those who traveled it. The ideal section's original road construction would last over 70 years after its completion, a testament to the planning and craftsmanship that went into that groundbreaking mile. While the road itself would be maintained regularly, the monument to memorialize the ideal section and Henry Osterman slowly dipped into disrepair. Historians in Dyer and Cherville, as well as the Indiana chapter of the re-established Lincoln Highway Association, realized that the monument needed immediate and exhaustive attention.
The ground was overgrown. All of the plaques were all mildewed and dated and unreadable.
It was in disrepair. The bronze tablets were severely corroded. They were falling off.
The lack of safe access to the monument, which was very close to modern-day Route 30, furthered its physical decline and made repair difficult.
There's no access to the project, so people were trying to figure out how do we get visitors to this safely. It is just a few feet from US 30, which of course there's cars traveling 55 miles an hour. And it seemed dangerous to be walking that close to the road.
Fortunately, the town of Dyer received a safety grant to install a sidewalk which passed by the monument site. The group was then able to restore the Osterman seat and elements of the ideal section monument close to its original condition.
All of the plaques have been redone. All of the mortar was redone. The landscaping and donations made by many local people as well as the Lincoln Highway Association. So a real combined effort. But what it took was leadership. And I think Bruce and his wife Marcia deserve most of the credit for providing that leadership. And then a whole slew of other people that jumped in.
In September of 2016, the revamped Ideal Section Monument was dedicated to an enthusiastic group of history buffs, local officials, and volunteers. During the celebration, a local Boy Scout troop helped to place a concrete marker, similar to ones installed by Scout troops across the country in 1928. Those who wanted to learn about the legendary roadway could now easily access the refurbished monument and learn about the breakthrough in engineering while standing just south of the site of the original Ideal Section.
We have the two interpretive signs there which do tell the story. It introduces people to the Lincoln Highway. It introduces people to the story of the Ideal Section. So there is things that even youngsters could learn by reading the two interpretive signs.
With the new sidewalk now, people can stroll along there and stop and sit on the bench and read the signs, and school groups have come and looked at it, and people who probably driven by this monument for years and years and years can now walk over and see what it's all about. It's kind of a nice place to visit.
It's beautiful when you get there. It's worth making the trip. So if people want to get out and explore, take a day trip or whatever and learn the history of roads, learn the history of the Lincoln Highway, or learn the history of automobiles, this is a good place to start.
Today, the Ideal Section of the Lincoln Highway looks like most other roads of Main Street, USA. It's a modern street that is part of the millions of miles of engineered highways that it inspired. The overhauled monument and a few marked bridges indicate to passerby that there was something special here. But for residents of Northwest Indiana and patrons of the Lincoln Highway, this unassuming 1-mile stretch of road will always be considered ideal.
The safety features and all the ideal things that went into that road are what we drive on today. The roads are reinforced. They have curbs, they have gutters, they have special bridges, there's safety features built into things. The new roads are starting to have an eye to the environment. And if you drive down any road today, any highway, all of these things can be traced back to the ideal section. So there is a story to tell. And what we have here in Dyer is a tribute to that and worth people stopping and visiting.